From the training station at Farragut, Idaho, came Bugler First Class Berman E. DeBoer to join N Division, which was composed of quartermasters and buglers. Hugh Bell, from the Oiler Trinity, by this time a quartermaster first class, was one of them. Another was a green seaman named Ed Haggie, and there were half a dozen others under the expert eye of Chief Pikowski. It was the same in every division. There were a handful of experienced men to teach hundreds of young Americans the way of the Navy. A week after the ship's commissioning, Commander Ballinger came to the captain's quarters early in the morning, seriously distressed. "Captain," he said, "I've got 4 reports of men sleeping on watch last night." "Who are they?" asked Captain Goodwin. Commander Ballinger knew what the captain meant. He had checked the service records of the men involved and had the facts in a brief memo. 2 of them were under 18 years of age, the other 2 were not yet 19, and all 4 were brand new sailors who had never been aboard a ship except in training. "What are we going to do about them, Captain?" The captain paused. "Well, Dick, I have to think this over. Hell, we can't have these guys up the mast for sleeping on watch. If you do, then I have to remember there's a war on and recommend them for a general court-martial. There's no way out of it. The example would have to be set. Let me think about it." All morning the captain worried over the problem. That afternoon he called the executive officer and told him to send the 4 offenders to the captain's cabin. That was all he did. He did not give any hint of what he might do. The 4 seamen came in, hats in hands. Captain Goodwin saw 4 young kids, younger than his own boy, who was just then in training at the United States Naval Academy. 4 kids from 4 different corners of America, standing there with only one shared attribute. They were all scared. "Sit down," said Captain Goodwin awkwardly. The 4 sailors sat, not knowing what to do with their hats or hands. The captain had a book before him on the desk. He picked it up. "You young men were reported for being asleep on watch last night," he said. He looked at each one of them. They looked down at the deck, and the room was as silent as Chaplain Carlson's chapel. The captain opened his book. "For the crimes of treason, sleeping upon your watch in time of war, the sentence of death," he said as a general court-martial may judge. He looked up, and the 4 young men were pale and hanging on every word. "Well, here we are," said the captain, shutting the book. "You sleeping on your watch, and the United States is in a state of war. I think you know that." The 4 boys nodded glumly. "And if I have you up to official mast, I have no alternative but to recommend you for trial by general court-martial. I really don't think that would further the war effort a great deal. So, I will tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to put this conference in a state of suspended animation just now. I don't recall that you were reported to me for being asleep on watch, but I don't want you to forget it. If you come up before me for mast for any serious breach of discipline or breach of regulations, then I will be forced to remember this incident. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir." The 4 young sailors filed out happily, and Captain Goodwin suppressed a smile as they closed the door to the cabin. There was no more difficulty on the ship with youngsters caught sleeping on watch. Indeed, the whole fabric of discipline seemed to be tightened by this incident. The velvet glove had done its work, and the Gambier Bay was becoming more of a sea-going ship every day. On January 16th, the Gambier Bay's communications department had a message for the captain. The ship had been discharged from the outfitting dock and was ordered to sea on her first shakedown run. According to the schedule, there was plenty of time. It was anticipated that nearly all of February would be spent getting the men used to their ship and accustoming the Air Department to life and operations aboard a carrier. At mid-morning, Captain Goodwin was on his bridge and gave the orders to cast off. The Gambier Bay left the pier, backed into the downriver channel of the Columbia, and the voyage began. Almost immediately, anyone with a grain of experience at sea could tell that here was a green ship with a green crew. Perhaps all that was needed was a look at the faces, for the forces of nature took over as the Gambier Bay crossed the bar. The Columbia River Bar is located just at the point where the continental shelf drops off into the deep ocean. Consequently, it is always muddy with turbulence, and that same turbulence swirls about the hull of a ship so that she tends to pitch and toss. The Gambier Bay, with no aircraft aboard and only about half her crew and stores, was riding high and light in the water as she crossed the bar. Further, a deep, low-pressure area had been hanging over the North Pacific for a week, and the winds were very near gale force. So the Gambier Bay had hardly gotten underway when the bodies began to fall. Bugler First Class Debord was standing watch on the bridge when the ship began to move. Soon he noticed the swells and began to have a queasy feeling in his stomach. Debord's father, who had also served in the Navy, had told him that if he stayed amidships he would not get seasick. He was not so sure. At 8 bells he was relieved and told to go down to the mess hall and get something to eat. He was not so sure of that either, but he headed down, walking along the gangway. He got a whiff of smoke coming from the stack, and then he was sure his father was dead wrong. Up it all came, everything that had been in his stomach, and over the side it went. Afterwards he felt better, so much better that he thought if he could get to the mess hall and get something to eat, he would be cured. So he resumed his journey and went to the deck below. When he reached the mess, he found it was nearly deserted. Only 2 men were there eating. One was the chief master-at-arms, nicknamed Mr. 5x5 for obvious reasons. The other was his chief assistant, whom Debord knew as Smitty. They were stowing away the food of the day, corned beef and cabbage. One whiff and Debord knew he had made a mistake. He fled for open air, and when he felt he could manage, he went to his bunk and tried to go to sleep. The ship tossed and turned and kept him awake most of the night. Aviation machinist's mate. 3rd Class Tony Paniak pulled guard duty that first night out. The swells during the afternoon had been noticeable, but he had managed to avoid getting sick. His guard post was at one of the 20 mm guns out over the side, just aft of the stack. As the wind increased, the ship began swinging. The wind blew across and under the flight deck, and without the usual weight to hold the ship down, the wind had a ying effect, something like that of a misplaced sail. An hour of this, with gusts of wind blowing smoke into his face from the stack, gave Paniak all he could bear. He lost his supper and reached back for his lunch, and finally his watch ended. He was able to stagger away from the scene of the torture, but for 3 days he could not eat, and even black coffee would not stay down. Old Salt Hugh Bell weathered the blow without a tremor, conditioned by the monsoon and the typhoons of the China Sea on that first tour with the Asiatic fleet. But even he noted in his diary that most of the crew were very seasick, and because of it that first night he had to stand double watch. The new 90-day wonders were as badly off as the enlisted men, and when the first few hours passed and Lieutenant Ranny Odom was still on his feet, he congratulated himself and went to dinner in the wardroom. That was his first mistake. His second mistake was to allow the catapult officer, Lieutenant Henry Pilgrim, to persuade him to go up on the flight deck and take a look at the mountainous waves rising around the ship. They went up, and the sight was truly impressive. Waves breaking over the flight deck at the bow, although that deck was supposed to stand 45 feet above the waterline. About a minute up there, watching the crashing of the waves and feeling the swaying of the ship, Lieutenant Odom too gave his all to Father Neptune. He then staggered to his bunk and tried to stop the feeling. The bunk kept moving one way while his stomach moved another. He worried for a while lest he die, then he worried lest he keep on living. To live or to die? The question raged in his body, his brain giving him one message and his stomach the opposite. At the height of agony, the loudspeaker in the room began to squawk. "Lieutenant Odom, report to the captain on the bridge." The thought of getting there, being there, made Lieutenant Odom sicker. What if he didn't go? They could only shoot him, couldn't they? And what was wrong with that? Asked his stomach. But his brain advised caution, and Lieutenant Odom obeyed his brain. Staggering, clutching, sometimes crawling, he made his way up 40 feet and across 150 feet of gyrating catwalk and passageway to the bridge. He raised his arms to salute. He nearly fell over. The captain caught his arm and steadied him. "Lieutenant, what's the forecast? Is it going to worsen or slack off?" Before Lieutenant Odom fell in with the treacherous Lieutenant Pilgrim, he had been well enough to study his maps and reports. They would enter Puget Sound through the Straits of San Juan de Fuca in a few hours, and in that protected water they should find haven from the storm, which was moving away from the Seattle area. He was able to give an intelligent, if weak, answer to the captain and was dismissed. He stumbled down to his office, only to find Petty Officer Ammon there, drinking coffee and as saucy as a 6-year man could be. Petty Officer Ammon watched the messages and advisories coming in and called the attention of his officer to the important factors from time to time. Lieutenant Odom then informed the bridge that his original prediction was holding. The weather did soften inside the Sound, and it was not long before they were coming into the protected harbour of Seattle. This was supposed to have been the beginning of the Gambier Bay's shakedown cruise, but most of the crew could swear that they had never been more badly shaken up in their lives. Later, the captain estimated that 85% of the crew was ill during the voyage to Seattle. As for the weather, this particular Kaiser canoe would never encounter anything worse, even in the far waters of the Pacific. They could not know that here in Seattle, the memory of that first brief voyage would be with most of them for quite a while. Days later, radio man Third Class McCollum, sitting in the chow hall and stoking away his dinner, noticed that the sailor directly across from him was looking hungrily at his plate but not eating a bite. "What's the matter?" asked McCollum. "Is there something wrong with the food?" "There's nothing wrong with the food," said his companion. "God damn it! I've lost my teeth and I'm hungry as hell." The junior officers and the men of the crew were hoping for shore leave in town, but they had no such luck. Captain Goodwin knew, and they did not, precisely how raw this ship's complement was, and he was determined to rectify that deficiency as quickly as possible. The flight deck view of the Seattle shoreline was the closest they came to mingling with civilian America. Captain Goodwin had a fixed schedule for shakedown, and he was determined to stick to it. The ship's chronometers and all the clocks aboard were sent ashore for tests and setting on Navy time. The ship was demagnetized so that it would not provide homing for magnetic mines. The Gambier Bay took on more crewmen from Bremerton, was fueled, and stores were stacked up in the lockers below. She went out into the Sound to test her catapult machinery, which performed satisfactorily. All this done, the Gambier Bay sailed south for San Francisco Bay. As she headed out to sea, Captain Goodwin had a little surprise for the men. Suddenly he ordered the call, "General Quarters." The alarm bell attached to the public address system began to clang. The bugler on duty sounded the General Quarters call throughout the ship, and the squawk box crackled. "Man your battle stations!" Men began running. Shoe leather scraped on steel, shoes clattered up and down ladders, and watertight doors banged with a hollow sound. An SNJ aircraft, laid on for the occasion, came out into the Sound to make simulated strafing and bombing runs on the carrier, while the gunners tracked the plane with their 20mm and 40mm anti-aircraft guns. When the SNJ disappeared over the horizon, Captain Goodwin ordered the ship secured from General Quarters, then spoke into the intercom. "You men seem to have had some difficulty tracking that plane. That was a single aircraft and a trainer at that. Where we're going, you must be prepared for real enemy air attacks. From now on, you are going to have an opportunity to drill and drill and drill." The captain was as good as his word. All the way south to San Francisco Bay, the gunners drilled and drilled and drilled. They aimed at seagulls, tracked blimps, and practiced loading and range-finding and readiness to fire against stopwatches. They went to General Quarters every few hours, practiced abandoning ship, and the captain held several inspections of crew and ship. Needless to say, there was fault to find in every operation, from gunnery to streaming the paravanes, the torpedo-shaped instruments designed to sever mines from their moorings. For most of the crew, it was a great thrill to sail into San Francisco Bay under the Golden Gate Bridge, past Alcatraz Island, still a federal prison in those days, under the San Francisco-Oakland Bay Bridge, and then to tie up at a pier next to Alameda Naval Air Station. At Alameda, there was shore leave by watches and departments as the Gambier Bay loaded fuel, aviation gas, more provisions and ammunition for the trip south to San Diego. The Gambier Bay was moored next to the pier, and after Navy fashion, with the starboard side of the ship inboard, gangways were fixed fore and aft to connect the ship with the shore. The enlisted men used the gangways to come and go on liberty, as well as to move supplies into the ship. At Alameda, the ship's security and order were always supervised by the officer of the deck, a senior officer who was directly responsible to the executive officer and the captain for discipline. His station was at the forward gangway, known as the quarterdeck. While in port, the junior officer of the deck stood at the after gangway and also made periodic inspections of the crew's quarters to see that all was well. One night in Alameda, Lieutenant Odom had the after gangway. He was on watch from 2000 to 2400 that night, and it was a quiet night. The port watch was on liberty, and the starboard watch was aboard, all safely bedded down at lights out. That's what the regulations said. But the officer of the deck heard some strange noises from the crew's compartments and ordered Lieutenant Odom below to investigate. Odom headed toward the bunk room in question, which he had to reach by going down a ladder. Just after 2300, he started down and saw a faint light where there should have been none, and heard the sound of excited whispers. He put his foot on the first rung of the ladder, which resounded with a clang, and as he did so, he could hear the distinctive clicking of dice. He started down, reached the bottom, and probed the compartment with his flashlight. Never in the history of the Navy had an officer of the deck come across such a still scene. Not one case of tossing and turning in this bunk room, no insomniacs here, but a compartment full of happy, angelic sailors sleeping peacefully, getting the rest they would need to do their proper duty the next day. Lieutenant Odom stopped for a moment to appreciate the full beauty of it, then turned and made his way back up the ladder to report that all was secure. He said nothing to the senior officer about the burning flashlight that had rolled beneath one of the bunks or of the scattered pile of greenbacks on the floor, nor did he ever ask how they divided up the money. The officers were able to go ashore for short periods, and Lieutenant Odom and several of his friends made the pilgrimage across the bay to San Francisco, where they rode the cable cars up Nob Hill and had steak at the top of the mark. But there were no long leaves. Shortly after arrival, Captain Goodwin received word from the 13th Naval District that the Gambier Bay's shakedown had been foreshortened. At Pearl Harbor, the call had been made for more aircraft to be delivered in a hurry, and several of the jeep carriers had been designated to become aircraft transports. Operation Flintlock, the capture of the Marshall Islands, was just then in progress. The invasion of Truk, the major Japanese base in the South Pacific, was envisioned that year but never came off. For that purpose, Admiral Nimitz, Admiral Towers, the air commander, and Admiral Hoover, the land-based air commander, wanted more aircraft in the Pacific in a hurry. The planes were coming off the assembly lines in very satisfactory numbers, the Army Air Force needs had been adequately met, and the Navy had nothing like its old troubles in getting aircraft. The problem was shipping space, with all the demands being made on available transport to support the series of Central Pacific invasions. The Gambier Bay's training program then would have to be carried out as she ferried aircraft out to Pearl Harbor and beyond, for she was to deliver planes to the fleet carrier Enterprise, thus saving the big ship a long trip to secure replacements in haste. Captain Goodwin sailed for San Diego and arrived on January 30th. Lieutenant Odom remembered the day because he had the duty and could not go ashore, and it was the first anniversary of his marriage to Florida. The best he could do was arrange for the wife of a shipmate to send a dozen roses. A day or so later, he did get ashore, and as they loaded planes, he had several brief leaves from duty. He and Padre Chaplain Carlson went ashore together on a trip to Tijuana, where they went for a long walk through the city. The Padre wanted to visit a typical residential district to see how the locals lived. Winding down a street of houses with drawn curtains, they saw hands beckoning them from behind the draperies. Just as Lieutenant Odom realized where they were, a Mexican policeman came up to inform them that they were in an off-limits area. Only the Padre's credentials saved them from an embarrassing set of explanations to the shore patrol. They got off scot-free, and Lieutenant Odom announced that in the future he would have to travel in more respectable company. He was not going to get caught in a red light district again. Early in February, the airplanes were brought to the pier, and heavy cranes began loading them aboard the Gambier Bay. They were Avenger bombers and Hellcat F-6F fighters. In all, 84 planes were stuffed aboard the little carrier, which meant every available space was used, including the flight deck. No flights could be made until the deck was cleared, but that made no difference. The first stop was to be Pearl Harbor, where some of the planes would be offloaded by crane. On February 7th, the planes were loaded, along with a group of passengers, including air crews for the planes and 400 Marines destined for Pearl Harbor. The little carrier moved out into the Pacific, running alone, a single ship in a lonely sea, for the Navy had no time or available escort ships to form a convoy. Captain Goodwin kept the training program going all the way. Every morning, an hour before dawn, Bugler de Boer or one of his associates stepped up to the public address system microphone and blared out the reveille call on his horn. "Hit the deck, sailors!" were the unwelcome, gritty words that followed. Then the day began. When the men were not on duty or at battle stations, they were encouraged to play basketball or volleyball on the forward elevator, which was lowered to hangar deck level. At night, the ship was blacked out, but the hangar deck was screened and a movie put on. 6 days after sailing, Gambier Bay arrived in Hawaii, and most of these young men had their first look at Pearl Harbor as they came in. Personal visions of the day of the Japanese attack clouded their minds. Aviation machinist's mate third-class PNC thought of home and how he had enlisted, although below draft age, because of the attack on Pearl Harbor. He thought of his close friend John Stasko, who had been killed in the sinking of the carrier Lexington in the first year of the war. Radioman Third Class Lee McCollum stood on the flight deck with hundreds of other sailors as they came in. They passed Battleship Row, where the oil still oozed up from the sunken Arizona. They tied up alongside Ford Island, near the Arizona, and someone said something about the 1,200 men who still lay down there, trapped inside at the moment of the attack. They were a quiet crowd of sailors that day. "We realized," said Radioman Third Class McCollum, "what the enemy could do to us and the danger that lay ahead." Quartermaster Bell had seen it all before and was more or less immune to the spell of Pearl Harbor, but the youngsters were awed by nearly everything they saw on Liberty. Bugler Deber and his pals separated as they left the ship. The pals headed for the nearest beer hall. Debor, not much of a beer drinker, really wanted a scoop of ice cream. Some of the men on Liberty headed for Hotel Street, the red light district in downtown Honolulu, where a girl or a fight could be found almost any time. Some headed up St. Louis Heights and Wilhelmina Rise, where the more expensive houses were located. Nearly all the new officers managed to stroll through Waikiki and take a look at the Royal Hawaiian Hotel, which was reserved as a rest and recreation center for returning submariners. But an ordinary sailor could still poke his toes in the warm Pacific at Waikiki Beach and drink a glass of pineapple juice or something stronger on the terrace of a hotel or restaurant along the strip of Kalakaua Avenue. After the Marines and the airplanes were discharged from the Gambier Bay, the officers and men expected to be sailing back to San Diego to pick up their own aircraft and their air crews. But the moment the cranes stopped lifting aircraft off the flight deck, they began lifting other aircraft onto that same deck. Below deck, the scuttlebutt was overflowing. What was going on, and where were they going now? What kind of sense did it make to take one batch of new planes off and put another batch on board? They counted 79 aircraft before the cranes stopped moving. What were they going to do with them? On February 16th, the crew had part of the answer. The Gambier Bay got underway and was headed for somewhere in the Marshall Islands. Quartermaster Bell might not be able to spell the name Marshall, but his anticipation had already been worked over. But then, nobody ever told the crew very much of anything. Still, with reasonable accuracy, the ship's telegraph functioned on the lower decks, and Quartermaster First Class Bell's diary entry was more or less correct. The Gambier Bay was heading for a point off Muro Atoll in the Marshalls. Heading into the war zone, the little carrier was accompanied this time by a destroyer to protect her against submarine attack, and they ran a zigzag pattern to avoid becoming sitting ducks. Every morning began with a call to battle stations, repeated at random throughout the day. As on the voyage from San Diego, Captain Goodwin did not miss an opportunity for training. As they moved out into the open sea, a plane from Barbers Point Naval Air Station approached, towing a sleeve target, and the 20 mm and 40 mm gunners went to work from their little nests called sponsons that lined the edges of the flight deck. The crew now knew why these were called pom-poms. The noise could be deafening. After the plane had disappeared, the 5-inch gun on the fantail was still able to fire against a sled towed after. Captain Goodwin wanted good marksmen when the time came to fire in earnest, and he wanted a good deal more than that, too. One of the routine duties of Lieutenant Odom, the aerology officer, was to take 2 upper air soundings daily under a directive from the Bureau of Naval Aeronautics in Washington. Coming down the coast from the northwest, Odom made the soundings every day by releasing a 30-inch balloon filled with helium from the flight deck. He and his men tracked the balloon's progress through the telescope of a theodolite and plotted the results for Washington. This practice, he had been told, would assist the Bureau in its plans. After the ship left San Diego and headed to Pearl Harbor, aerology continued its daily observations under the benign eye of the captain on his bridge. But on this first day at sea heading toward the Marshalls, when weather released its balloon, Ammon had scarcely begun tracking when the squawk box began sounding throughout the ship. "Now hear this! Now hear this! Lieutenant Odom, report to the captain on the bridge." Lieutenant Odom started. He was in the operations office at the moment. Before he headed for the bridge, he stopped to talk to Ammon. "Had someone fouled up, Mr. Odom?" Ammon asked. "I think it has to do with our balloon release. Captain Goodwin has watched us go through this routine many times and always seemed pleased, but just now, when we did the same thing, he seemed much put out." Lieutenant Odom made a mental checklist. The others were following his instructions, and he was following the Bureau's directive. He could not understand what the captain might be unhappy about. When he appeared on the bridge, he gave his smartest salute. "Lieutenant Odom reporting to the captain as ordered, sir." "Lieutenant Odom," said Captain Goodwin, "have you ever heard of ship safety at sea?" "Yes, sir, of course I have." "Then why, in the name of Almighty God, did you release that balloon just now?" Lieutenant Odom was about to say that he had not released the balloon. Aerographer Ammon had, but he was smart enough to bite his tongue. "The Bureau of Naval Aeronautics All Ships Directive says—" The captain turned red. "Lieutenant Odom, I do not give a damn what the Bureau of Naval Aeronautics. All ships' directives say about how a captain shall run his ship in the face of the enemy. Do you realize that the balloon you sent up could help the enemy spot us from God knows what distance?" "Sir, but the all ships' directive—" The captain made a rude noise. "The all ships' directive, sir, is very specific. Shall I get my copy and show you?" "Paragraph no." "Lieutenant, do not get your copy. Just listen. I understand that the Bureau wants weather information, and believe me or not, I also understand why they want it. But if you were captain of this ship, Lieutenant, and you faced the choice of no information about the winds aloft or possible discovery by the enemy by the release of the balloon, what would you do?" Lieutenant Odom's face cleared. "The former option, sir." The captain heaved a sigh of relief. "All right, Lieutenant Odom, we are agreed. No more balloons unless you have my express approval. Is that understood?" Aye, sir." Lieutenant Odom then left the bridge with a snappy salute. He did not notice the faraway look in the captain's eye. On February 18th, the Radio Shack picked up news broadcasts that told of an enormous attack by American naval aircraft on the Japanese base at Truk. The scuttlebutt had it that after discharging some of their planes at the Marshalls, they would sail for Truk and join the fight. How they were going to get a squadron of pilots and air crewmen aboard was not considered in the scuttlebutt. Quartermaster Bell, for one, was sure they were heading into their first battle. If my guess is right, When we leave the Marshall Islands, there will be a few less Japanese. The next day, the Gambier Bay fueled its escort destroyer. In the afternoon, the planes were gassed up, and some of the engines were started. Late that afternoon, they sighted a convoy of 8 ships on the horizon. The destroyer went charging off to investigate and then came back. They were American. On February 20th, they reached the rendezvous point. They did not actually have the Enterprise in sight, but Captain Goodwin was in contact. Early in the morning, the Gambier Bay began launching planes by catapult. That was the only way, as the flight deck was so crowded there was no room for takeoff. The first 65 planes were catapulted. The last 14 took off from the flight deck. Then the Gambier Bay turned and headed back to Pearl Harbor, her mission accomplished. Landing Signal Officer McClendon was aboard. He made the trip with the Gambier Bay to Majuro to evaluate the plane-handling crews. Later that day, fortunately for an F-6F Hellcat fighter pilot in distress, the Gambier Bay took him and his plane safely aboard. On February 25, 1944, the ship's log recorded its first carrier landing. Quartermaster Bell did not see much of the action because he spent the whole day at the ship's wheel. It was double duty, but Captain Goodwin needed an experienced man at the helm. He finally realized there would be no battle for the Gambier Bay. The news came that the air battle for Truk had ended in the sinking of many Japanese ships and the destruction of Japanese aircraft on the ground and in the air. They sailed back to Pearl Harbor and arrived on February 26th. The fleet band came down to the dock to meet them and played as the ship tied up. They were all very proud of their ship and the role they had played in this last action. The next day, the Gambier Bay was loading planes again. But what planes this time? They were taking a load of war-weary planes back for a set of embryo aviators to crack up in the training fields of America. They sailed on Leap Day, February 29, 1944, which meant good luck. It was confirmed soon enough. Captain Goodwin was not satisfied with the Gambier Bay's performance. He wanted her put in dry dock for repainting of the bottom and correction of excessive vibration of the screws at high speed. That meant the ship would be laid up for at least 2 weeks, and that, in turn, meant liberty and leave for the old salts, who now had green verdigris on their brass. USS Kitten Bay joined them on the voyage back to San Diego, and they arrived, pennants flying and hearts as light as they could be. Shortly before Christmas, the pilots and air crews of Composite Squadron 10 took off for California to continue their training and made their various ways down to Holtville, about 100 miles due east of San Diego and just above Mexicali on the other side of the border. How they got there depended very much on the temperament of the pilots involved. Ensign James Lisher more or less floated in, having spent 2 nights and a day in San Francisco en route on the champagne and nightclub circuit. Almost the moment he arrived, he was off on another party. Commander Huxell let the pilots take their airplanes during Christmas if they had relatives anywhere in the vicinity. Ensign Henry Peasy's brother was an Army Air Force navigator stationed at Santa Ana, and he had his torpedo bomber for the holiday. He gave Lisher a ride to Santa Ana, and Lisher then went on to see a friend nearby who took him to his uncle's house. We spent Christmas Eve getting plastered by the fire, had a swell time but had to leave early the next day, so missed out on a big turkey dinner. By the time Ensign Lisher returned to Holtville, the squadron was getting organized. Before the planes had left Victoria, Chief Flanders was assigned to shepherd the squadron ground personnel by train, a job that made him wince. Taking 200 men that far entailed enormous responsibility. The big problem came during a 2-hour layover at Los Angeles, and a number of the men were from that area. Of course, they paid no more attention to Chief Flanders's instructions than if he had not issued them. The train left minus a number of Composite Squadron 10 personnel who were eventually sent on by later trains. One of the escapes was captured by the Shore Patrol, and then the Shore Patrol came looking for the officer in charge of the detail. When they found Chief Flanders, they read him off for inattention to duty and put him on report. When Flanders reached Holtville, he told the whole story to Commander Huxell and presented the charges made against him. Huxell looked at them, grinned, and put them on the table. "Don't worry about it," he said. Flanders never heard of the incident again. Coming down from Victoria, some of the squadron's planes got separated from the others when they ran into bad weather. Out of Alameda, they ran into fog. Some of them, including a torpedo bomber fighter in which Chief Montgomery was riding, found conditions so bad the only way they could get their position was to come down onto the deck, follow railroads and highways, and check the names on railroad stations. But they all arrived safely and soon were at work in the training program. Holtville, the squadron soon found, was anything but an ideal station. The sun blazed down on them all day, and at night it turned uncomfortably cold. It was so hot in the daytime that a man could get a bad burn from just touching the cowling of an engine on the flight line, so they did the maintenance work at night, shivering in the wind. Lieutenant William Cordner joined the squadron at Holtville to take over instruction in aerial gunnery and bombardment. The torpedo pilots learned glide bombing against a wooden fence into the Salton Sea. Each day they would demolish the fence. Each night the maintenance crew would rebuild it. They began practicing at night too, using radar approaches, which meant the maintenance crew stayed up late. Finally, the squadron bombers attained an average of 80% hits at Holtville. The torpedo pilots got their air crews, and each was assigned a turret gunner and a radio radar operator. These assignments were intended to be permanent, and most of them turned out that way. Ensign Peasy was assigned radio man Jerry Pauls and gunner Bob Jensen. Ensign Hovey Seymour, a Yale football hero, was assigned gunner Charles Westbrook and radioman Larry Austin. Westbrook was pleased, as in the training program, various crewmen had flown with various pilots and gained different preferences. For a crewman whose life depended on the skill of the man in the pilot's seat, this was an important selection in training. Westbrook had flown a few times with Lieutenant Sandy Sanderson, who had been a scout bomber pilot before he transferred to Composite Squadron 10 and torpedo bombers. Sanderson took delight in barrel-rolling the torpedo bomber, which was strictly against orders since the heavy plane had a tendency to stall in such manoeuvres. So while Westbrook liked Sanderson and knew he was a good pilot, he was much more comfortable flying with the more conservative Ensign Seymour. After hours, when the pilots could leave the base, some headed for the Rice Bowl Cafe in El Centro, and some for the Henda de Anza in Calexico, where most of the married officers lived. The wives played bridge and gossiped, and they all waited. It was apparent the squadron would be moving soon. On January 20th, the squadron was moved to Brown Field on Otay Mesa near Chula Vista, again along the Mexican border. During the move, the pilots had leave, and Ensign Lisher took the opportunity to go into Los Angeles with several of his buddies for another binge. They stopped at the Clark Hotel after visiting a number of bars, and then went out to dinner at Earl Carroll's. Ensign Lisher made a date with a girl he met at Carroll's, and after she got off work at 11 p.m., they went dancing at the Palladium, where Harry James was playing. The other pilots became bored having no girls, and at 2 o'clock in the morning they stole a taxicab, drove over half of Los Angeles, and then parked the cab in front of the Clark Hotel. They went upstairs and drank the rest of Lisher's liquor before stumbling into bed. At Brown Field, the men of Composite Squadron 10 met the officer who, in the future, could very well mean the difference between surviving and becoming a casualty aboard the carrier. He was their landing signal training officer, assigned to Brown Field to give this new squadron preliminary work in the most difficult task of takeoff and landing from the short deck of an escort carrier. Lieutenant McClendon knew his specialty. After his own training in 1942 as an aviation cadet in the V-5 program, he had been assigned to VF-29 Fighter Squadron 29 and had served aboard the escort carrier Santee. In the fall of 1942, the Santee's planes were involved in the North African invasion. In 1943, the ship was transferred to the South Atlantic on anti-submarine patrol duty between Dakar and Rio. McClendon had been selected for the Landing Signal Officer Training Program and had gone to Lee Field near Jacksonville, Florida, to learn his demanding job. At Brown Field, he staked out a piece of runway the size of a Jeep carrier flight deck and managed to secure a single arresting wire rig for practice. He began to teach these embryo carrier pilots the techniques of landing on a short runway. When he was finished with them, he expected to take on a new batch and then another. For 3 weeks, Composite Squadron 10 trained intensively at Brown Field, with the pilots flying long hours every possible day. At Holtville, the senior squadron officers had been able to bring their wives, who lived in a shabby motor court near the field. At Otay Mesa, conditions were much better. Lieutenant Stewart, the fighter flight leader, found a nice apartment in Chula Vista, close enough to San Diego's North Island Officers Club and the Coronado Hotel to make it a pleasant short station. Pilot Lisher and the other hot pilots did their share of celebrating in San Diego too, but there was hard work at the field. Commander Huxtable let them all know the pressure was on. The Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet Headquarters wanted them out in the Pacific in a hurry. Just before the end of January, Composite Squadron 10 was given new fighter planes to replace the F-4Fs they had been assigned. That meant more familiarization for the pilots, and by the end of the month, they were flying tactical missions and making mock attacks on United States fleet warships at sea out of San Diego. There was still plenty to be learned by all hands. One day, Pilot Lisher set out on a mission in his new fighter. Just as he took off, oil began pouring out of his tank, and he had to land. One of the handlers had left the cap off the tank. By the time the oil sump was topped off and he took off again, he could not find the others and came back. But under the watchful eye of Chief Montgomery and the others, such mistakes became less frequent, and by February 1st, the squadron was beginning to shape up. In the second week of February, as the Gambier Bay sailed for Pearl Harbor to deliver aircraft to the Pacific Fleet, Composite Squadron 10 was ready for its first serious carrier trials. In February, the pilots and air crews of Composite Squadron 10 were ordered to the USS Alamaha for carrier qualification trials. On March 2nd, they began with the experienced Lieutenant McClendon as backup for the young Alamaha landing signal officer. The landing signal officer station aboard the carrier was the last corner on the port side. Behind the position was a dark canvas windshield that also served to contrast the fluorescent paddles the landing signal officer used to signal approaching pilots. To the left of the landing signal officer station was a padded pit into which the landing signal officers could leap if a plane came in too low. On March 2nd, the trials began on a good, clear flying day. It was the first time that many of the crews had flown together for a carrier landing. The fighter pilots all landed safely, although some of them came in fast and approached the barrier. Then the torpedo planes began to land. Ensign Hovey Seymour was in the pattern just ahead of Ensign Pizarski. As they turned into the wind, Gunner Westbrook looked down at the carrier, which seemed to him roughly the size of a matchbox. Ensign Seymour brought the plane in carefully, and all was going very well until they were just over the ship, and the Alamaha landing signal officer gave Seymour the come-on. But for some reason the torpedo bomber dropped too fast. Suddenly, as Seymour dropped down, Pizarski saw the Alamaha landing signal officer signal wildly with a rowing motion. It meant, "You need more power, more power." The torpedo bomber was beginning to turn to the left, nose high, which threatened an immediate stall. The Alamaha landing signal officer leapt for the pit, and McClendon was right behind him. Seymour's plane managed to clear the end of the flight deck, but there was no way he could recover altitude, and the torpedo bomber fell off into the stall. The destroyer escort standing by accelerated as her captain saw that the bomber would crash. The plane turned over on the port wing and circled back to the port side of the carrier, then hit the water at a 30-degree angle, nose and port wing first. The tail came back up with the wings above the waterline, but the angle was still very steep, and the pilot's compartment was under water. Gunner Westbrook reached for the turret escape hatch the moment they hit, but it jammed. When the plane came back up, he tried again and got out. Radioman Austin escaped through the tunnel, both ankles sprained from bracing himself against the radio mounts for the crash. Ensign Seymour was not seen again. The destroyer escort picked up the two men, and they were dried off and sent ashore that night at the destroyer base at San Diego. The next morning they caught a ferry to North Island, and then a bus back to Brown Field. On the bus, they met a pilot who was also going to escort Carrier 73 as Hovey Seymour's replacement. The Navy lost no time, as Westbrook and Austin learned that day. The new pilot was Ensign Crocker, and the crewmen would fly with him from that time on. Although the air crews of Composite Squadron 10 were sobered by the loss of Ensign Seymour, there was nothing to do but carry on. The demanding routine aboard the Altamaha was a grueling one, with pilots waking up at 5:15 a.m. and starting their first flights by 7 a.m. The constant training, including patrols, attacks, and navigation, left little room for respite. Despite the high stress, especially after the early loss of Ensign Seymour, the squadron continued its rigorous preparation. The squadron's transfer to Inyokern, California, marked the transition to final organization. Here, torpedo pilots calibrated their bomb sights and learned to fire wing rockets. During their brief leave in Los Angeles, the pilots indulged in Hollywood's nightlife and movie sets, briefly escaping the harsh realities of their training. They encountered various celebrities, including Judy Garland and Lana Turner, although their experience with Hollywood was tinged with disappointment. As the Gambier Bay prepared to receive Composite Squadron 10, Captain Goodwin focused on readiness and repairs. Lieutenant Odom's personal challenge of securing leave to witness the birth of his child highlighted the sacrifices made by service members. Despite Captain Goodwin's reputation as a strict officer, he granted Odom leave, though with tight constraints. Odom's swift journey to Savannah and back, involving flights and hitchhiking, underscored the logistical challenges faced by personnel. His return before the dry dock became available was crucial to keeping the ship's schedule on track. Once docked, the Gambier Bay underwent necessary maintenance and preparations for its role. The ship's band played to lift morale as the crew completed the work. The Gambier Bay's qualification exercises, which included practicing carrier operations with F-4U Corsair fighters, were essential for integrating the ship with its new squadron. The ship's readiness was further tested with various training scenarios, including landing practices. Lieutenant McClendon's role as landing signal officer was instrumental in guiding pilots through these challenging exercises. By April 3rd, the Gambier Bay began loading its own carrier squadron, Composite Squadron 10, and continued its final phase of shakedown operations. The demanding conditions and intense training were designed to ensure that the Gambier Bay and its crew were fully prepared for the combat zones they would soon face. Men aboard the Gambier Bay were a little surprised to learn that the captain's son was aboard for this exercise. While it was unusual, there was nothing irregular about his presence. Hugh H. Goodwin, Jr. was a midshipman on leave from the United States Naval Academy to check out naval aviation, which he had deemed as his future specialty. Of course, not all midshipmen had the run of a carrier at sea, but this simply offered proof that the Navy could be a human institution. As long as he did not get in the way, he could observe to his heart's content. What young Goodwin observed was one of the toughest trials ever to befall a green carrier squadron. His father was determined that the Gambier Bay would be the best ship of her class in the fleet, which meant excelling both in the air and on the sea. Flight operations began on April 5th. Commander Huxell had butterflies in his stomach that first day, as he looked down the length of the 480-foot flight deck, with the memory of Ensign Hovey Seymour's last attempted landing flashing into his mind. To be sure, he had put his crew through the paces over the past 2 months. They had practiced field carrier landings repeatedly. On the day the air crews and pilots came aboard, Commander Huxell let them know that their ship's captain was a spit-and-polish officer, both a submariner and a pilot, who expected a very high degree of performance. Then Commander Bohr arrived, a legendary figure from Naval Academy football days, known for single-handedly defeating Notre Dame teams 2 years in a row for Navy. Commander Bohr began to talk, every sentence prefixed with, "The captain wanted me to convey," or, "It is the captain's wish that." By the end, the pilots of Composite Squadron 10 were asking each other why the captain didn't come and tell them these things himself. They already sensed that life here was going to be different. How different became evident almost immediately. The first flight operations consisted of learning to ride the catapult under the direction of Lieutenant Pilgrim. One afternoon, after catapulting off the deck, Ensign Pisarski was flying formation when Bob Jensen, his turret gunner, accidentally tripped the latch to the turret hatch. The hatch cover flew out and embedded itself in the vertical fin of the empennage. Commander Huxell saw what had happened and flew over to inspect the damage. He instructed Pisarski to land, and the young pilot dropped down toward the carrier. Lieutenant McClendon told him to make a round of the carrier so he could assess the damage. When it was decided that it was safe for Pisarski to land, McClendon brought him in so carefully that the torpedo bomber hooked the No. 1 restraining wire and received a well done from the bridge. When Pisarski got out of the cockpit and inspected the hatch cover, he saw that another 6 inches in, and the fin and rudder controls would have been destroyed. The pilots soon learned that there was a great advantage to having Bill McClendon as their landing signal officer. They trusted him because they knew he knew his job. Despite Commander Huxell's misgivings, his young men proceeded to perform admirably. On April 6th, Captain Goodwin headed the Gambier Bay into the wind, and the ship began operations. Not a plane was lost or hurt that day, nor was the second day blighted. However, on April 8th, as Ensign Nick Carter brought his torpedo bomber in for landing, the engine failed and he had to ditch alongside. Pilot, gunner, and radio man all got out safely and were soon picked up by a destroyer and taken back to North Island. The next day they had a brand new Avenger and flew out to join the carrier again. On the landing approach, the engine failed again, and Ensign Carter had to ditch once more. All 3 men escaped the sinking bomber and were picked up by a destroyer that delivered them by Breach's buoy to the Gambier Bay. Commander Huxell did not blame Pilot Carter. His 2 forced landings had been due entirely to mechanical failures. However, Carter was badly shaken and decided his luck had run out. He asked for a transfer out of the air service, and a sympathetic skipper Huxell agreed that, under Carter's circumstances, it might be best for him. After 4 days, the squadron seemed to be in fine shape, and Commander Huxell's butterflies began to disappear. Then, Airplot notified Captain Goodwin that a transport plane in distress had radioed from 500 miles west of San Diego. He broke off the normal exercises to conduct a search for the transport, which took them into a storm. The search area itself was clear, but the Gambier Bay moved into high winds and heavy swells. Commander Huxtable flew in the first search group, and when he returned to the carrier, he found her bouncing like a cork in the heavy sea. The stem had a 40-foot pitch. He came in on the approach, and Signal Officer McClendon gave him a high cut that meant land automatically. Commander Huxtable lined up with the bridge and then looked at the carrier's deck. It was going down, but he had been trained to accept the orders of the landing signal officer. This time, said Huxtable, he hoped to God McClendon knew more than he did. He slammed the stick forward, gave the plane full left aileron, and dived for the deck. When he saw it coming at him, he pulled the stick full back and let her slam in on the flight deck. His plane captain, aviation machinist's mate second-class Gutweiler, said he saw the left tire go so flat as it smacked the deck that the rim of the wheel hit the deck and chipped, but the tire held, and Huxtable was down safe. The squadron skipper was worried that he might lose some of the young pilots to the wicked weather, so he went up to the island to talk to Commander Boris, the air officer. He said he was afraid they would have a bad accident if they continued to operate in these conditions. Boris agreed and passed the complaint on to Captain Goodwin. The captain was obdurate. They must continue the search, he said. Lieutenant Stewart, the flight leader, came in shortly afterward on his downwind landing leg. He noticed that the bow of the carrier dropped so far into the trough of the last wave that the next wave broke over the flight deck, which was supposed to be 60 feet above water. He came in to land, he said, only because there was no place else to go, and he too wanted operations suspended. But Boris and Huxtable gave him the bad news. The captain insisted that they keep on. The flights continued all day. They never found the passenger plane, and the next day they were in no condition to operate because only 3 of the torpedo bombers and 4 fighters were undamaged. The impact of landing on a rising deck had flattened tires, bent the landing gear of the bombers, and snapped the tail wheels off the fighters. 3 fighters ended up in the barrier, and by the time the fighters landed, it had taken an hour. The torpedo bombers had it even rougher. PFC Pizarski popped both tires, and one came off the wheel, rolling down the deck and washing overboard as the bow dipped into a wave. The pilots and air crews gained the impression that Captain Goodwin was more concerned with having a showdown with Composite Squadron 10 than in the welfare of his men. As they came back to San Diego, someone told them the transport plane did not ditch, hence no survivors in the sea. The pilots began to believe the whole exercise was an opportunity for Captain Goodwin. That view was given substance when Captain Goodwin wrote a fitness report on the squadron that listed many deficiencies. The report soon reached Commander James Flatley, Chief Training Officer for Pacific Air. If the squadron was that bad, either the commanding officer was incompetent or the training was insufficient. If Lieutenant Commander Huxtable was incompetent, he should be relieved, or if the training was improper, perhaps Flatley ought to be relieved. He was concerned enough to pursue the matter and call Huxtable for an investigative conference. Flatley raised serious questions about the endangering of the young pilots and the danger to military equipment caused by the captain's reluctance to land the planes ashore where the weather was clear. In the end, the fitness report was amended. One point was certainly proved. Composite Squadron 10 was prepared to operate anywhere under any conditions. Even years later, Lieutenant Stewart claimed that in all his flying days he had never operated under worse conditions than those the Gambier Bay faced in that April storm west of the Catalina Islands off the coast of California. The month of April was spent tidying up at San Diego, installing the last of the equipment, integrating the air squadron with the ship, and taking on more carrier personnel. Carter transferred out on April 16th. The squadron's aircraft and air crews went off for amphibious support training at the Naval Air Station in San Diego. Here they learned that the mission of the Gambier Bay was not going to be what many had thought. Unlike the Atlantic, where the German U-boats were a major menace, in the Pacific the Japanese used their submarines as arms of the fleet, not as commerce raiders. So, while the jeep carriers that went east became parts of anti-submarine warfare teams, the tactic was not needed in the Pacific. What was needed was every bit of air support for the invading forces that moved against the Japanese-held islands of the Central Pacific. A major lesson of the ferocious struggle on the beach at Tarawa was the need for softening up, and the Gambier Bay was to become a part of the amphibious landing teams at the Gilberts and the Marshalls. Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner had been developing the tactics of amphibious landings. He required constant air cover. At the same time, Admiral Towers and the Young Turks, which included Joe Clark and Arthur Radford, Captain Goodwin's friend, were agitating for the independent use of the fleet carrier force that grew so rapidly. They were supported by Admiral William F. Halsey and Admiral Mark Mitcher in their exuberant campaign to turn the fast carrier task force loose against the enemy, rather than pin it down at a landing operation in support of troops. They wanted Turner and his subordinates to use the escort carriers for this purpose, and to a certain extent they managed to win their point. Turner, of course, would have liked to have every airplane in the Pacific supporting his landing operations, but by the spring of 1944 it had become apparent that Japanese air power in the outlying reaches of the empire was badly depleted. The attack on Tarawa had wiped out a large segment of that power. The strikes on the Marshalls before the Gilberts' landing had done much to wreck Japanese air power in that area. When the Americans attacked the Marshalls, the defences were not as strong as they had expected them to be. But the closer the Pacific Fleet came to the inner empire, the harder the going was to be, and everyone knew that Admiral Towers and the other aviators advocated a course of hitting hard with airstrikes, knocking the power out before the troops approached the beaches. Admiral Spruance, Admiral Turner, and to a certain extent Admiral Nimitz wanted to be conservative and keep the big carriers within calling distance of the landing forces, but the small carriers would play an integral role just off the beaches. While the operating arm of Composite Squadron 10 was training, the squadron structure was being changed aboard the Gambier Bay. Some 300 men had been trained at Asoria, and now the squadron was trimmed down to 80 officers and men. Other personnel came aboard the carrier. A draft of men just out of boot camp was taken aboard from Balboa Park. Most of them were 17 and 18 years old, and one of these was Charles Hinnell, son of a mortician from Minster, Ohio. They came aboard very green and had to be taught that ropes were not ropes but lines, and the floor was not a floor but a deck, and all the other intricacies of life at sea. At the end of April, Composite Squadron 10 returned. This time the officers too had to come aboard to stay. The time had come for the married men to part from their wives. Lieutenant Bassett, Lieutenant Vine Bell, and Lieutenant Dr. Wayne Stewart pulled their duffel together, bid their wives goodbye, and came aboard the carrier. Louise Bassett, Flonnie Bell, and Virginia Stewart set out together in the Bassett car for the south. Louise Bassett was going home to Madison, Florida, to reclaim her little boy. Virginia Stewart would stop with her for a while before going on back to Pennsylvania to her home. Flonnie Bell was going back to Thomasville, Georgia, to await the return of her husband, Vine. As they left, Vine Bell went up the gangplank of the Gambier Bay, the last officer to come aboard, and took his duffel to stateroom 206, where there was just one bunk remaining, the upper above Lieutenant Ranny Odom. There was one last bit of liberty. Aviation machinist's mate, third-class Peniak and George Zubri decided to go down to Tijuana. They stopped at the Brown Bear Tavern in National City and the Tropicana Club. The shore patrol came in at the Tropicana, but fortunately Peniak had his second identification card that showed his age as 21, so he managed to escape a pair of very suspicious sailors. Then it was time to sail. The ship loaded a contingent of Marines from the 2nd Marine Air Wing, who bedded down wherever they could find a spot on the crowded ship. The sailors, playing old salts, took the greenies under their wings. Aviation machinist's mate, third-class Peniak, befriended an upstate New York Marine named Andy Horvat, who gave him a 10-inch bayonet as a souvenir. At the Naval Air Station on North Island, the Gambier Bay loaded stores and supplies, her own contingent of aircraft. The flight deck was filled with more new planes for Pearl Harbor, so they were to do another ferry job. This time the men of the Gambier Bay sensed that they would not be coming back, but going on the other way toward Tokyo. On that last day, Captain Goodwin brought a party aboard the ship for a tour. He was proud of his ship and what he had done with the crew to make a fighting unit of the Gambier Bay, and he wanted to show off a little. With him on the tour of the ship were Mrs. Alina Goodwin, her friend Mrs. Batty, wife of a classmate of Goodwin's at the United States Naval Academy, and Miss Ann Batty, a California high school senior whose features, form, and red hair had the 17 Club falling all over themselves to make sure she got whatever she desired. Captain Goodwin sent for the ship's photographer, Chief Weldon Sparrow, and had him take pictures of Miss Batty sitting on a 2,000-pound bomb. She autographed the bomb with chalk. Best wishes to Tojo, and a dozen pilots swore that they would deliver the present personally. On May 1st, the Gambier Bay sailed from San Diego in company with the Kitkun Bay and the Hogut Bay, all bound for Hawaii. It was a foggy day, so shortly after they left North Island, the land was obscured from view. Still, many men clustered around the fantail and on the flight deck, looking back. It was sort of hard to realize they weren't coming back for months instead of days or weeks. Ensign Leisha wrote home. The journey to Hawaii would take 8 days. To pass the time profitably, Lieutenant Bell, the intelligence officer, gave daily briefings on the Japanese, their war tactics, their traditions, and their code of honor, Bushido. He reviewed plane and ship identification and talked about survival at sea. Some of the pilots played cribbage in the ready room, while Ensign Bucky Duran did needlepoint. Lieutenant Bell, when not lecturing, went off to stateroom 206 and pecked at the typewriter, starting a new novel, The Renegade Queen. Down on the hangar deck, the Marines were packed in like sardines. It had been turned into an 80 by 400 feet bunk room. Suspended from the flight deck joists above was a Stinson 01 observation plane that belonged to the Marines. The pilot, a Marine major, spent his days in the wardroom where he organized a poker game that lasted 5 days. At first, the major lost, But in the middle of the game, his luck changed, and at the end there was no beating him. The Navy pilots borrowed and borrowed from non-playing pals to stay in the game, and in the end, the Major won thousands of dollars. The game ended when some onlookers tipped the players that the Major had marked at least one deck, but there was no going to the captain, as naval regulations outlawed gambling aboard ship, and the innocent would have been tried right along with the guilty. As the game broke up, there were a dozen Navy pilots who asked nothing more than to have that Stinson observation plane in their gun sights over some invasion beach. As the Gambier Bay drew closer to Pearl Harbor, an air of solemnity permeated the ship. Lieutenant Odom looked around the wardroom at dinner one night and, seeing nothing but sober faces, wondered how many of these pilots would be delivered to a watery grave in the coming months. Padre Carlson had not been pleased with church attendance on Sundays during the early days of the ship's life, but suddenly, after they left San Diego, the hangar deck filled up on that first Sunday at sea, and the men sang the hymns with feeling. Eternal Father, strong to save, whose arm hath bound the restless wave, who bids the mighty ocean deep its own appointed limits keep, O hear us when we call to thee for those in peril on the sea. On May 8th, the little squadron approached Pearl Harbor. Commander Bors was launched in a Wildcat to take messages to Pearl Harbor and arrange for their reception. They tied up at Ford Island, and the Marines and the cargo of airplanes were moved ashore. The next morning the ship got underway again, this time in conjunction with the Kit Kun Bay and a number of other vessels of various sorts. Although none of lesser rank than the captain could have known, they were training for the forthcoming invasion of the Mariana Islands to be the first breach in the Japanese Empire's secondary perimeter of defence. Admirals King and Nimitz were already talking about the next move, which they planned to make against Formosa in the heart of that empire. This particular exercise involved a simulated landing on the beach of a small Hawaiian island. The old battleships, California, Tennessee, Colorado, and Maryland, were all to give fire support with their guns as they would in the Marianas. They were escorted by destroyers, which would also be called upon to lay fire on special points on request. The escort carriers would supply combat air patrol to protect the force from air attack, and airstrikes were called for. Lieutenant Bassett led one section of torpedo bombers out. On coming back, he flicked the switch on his radio transmitter to tell Airplot he was on his way, but mistakenly hit the long-wave transmission switch instead of the short-wave. Captain Goodwin heard the transmission, and when it ended, he turned to Lieutenant Odom, who was on the bridge. "Who is leading that flight?" "Bassett, sir. Go down to the flight deck. When Lieutenant Bassett lands, bring him up here immediately." Lieutenant Odom did not know what was on the captain's mind, except that he was annoyed. But the junior officers of the Gambier Bay had grown used to the captain's harsh application of discipline. At least Odom knew that Bassett had trouble waiting for him on the bridge. Bassett landed. When he cut his engine and stepped down from the cockpit, Odom escorted him straight to the bridge. The captain speared Bassett with a withering look. "Lieutenant Bassett, do you know what you just did?" "Landed, sir." "I perceive that." "No. I am speaking of what you did on the radio. Do you know I told Airplot we were coming in?" "Yes, Lieutenant Bassett." "And you also informed every enemy vessel within 5,000 miles of Pearl. Do you know, Lieutenant Bassett, the difference between shortwave and long-wave radio?" "Yes, sir." "Do you know that there are different switches to be pulled for different purposes?" "Yes, sir." "Do you also know that your instructions were to use the shortwave frequency assigned to this ship for communications?" "Yes, sir." "I am not sure, Lieutenant Bassett. I am not sure at all. You will return to your quarters and consider yourself under close quarters arrest until further notice. Perhaps you will take the opportunity to study the radio manual." "Yes, sir." Captain Goodwin got a faraway look in his eye. Would they ever learn? The captain's concern was amplified the next day when one of the F-4Fs came in for a hard landing and flipped on its back. The air crews brought up a small truck-mounted crane called a cherry picker to lift the wreck. They should have secured the crane for stability, which was what they had been taught, but they were in a hurry because there were more F-4Fs circling above them, so they hooked the crane to the airplane and began to lift without stopping to tie the crane down. The same swell that had caused the flight deck to lift up on the wrecked F-4F caught the Carrier again, and the crane toppled over on its side. Every man on the flight deck jumped, but one, Larry Ransom, did not make it and was crushed between the overturning crane and the deck. The captain suffered as another victim was chalked up to inexperience. Captain Goodwin became so concerned with the performance of the ship's crew and the squadron that he called Padre Carlson to the bridge and asked him to make a copy of a certain quotation from the Bible. A day or so later, a notice appeared on the bridge weather shield. "Even as Jesus Christ admonished his disciples, Mark 8:18, so do I admonish you. Having eyes, do you not see? And having ears, do you not hear? And can you not remember?" That night, they practiced night carrier landings. Captain Goodwin insisted on that extra margin, for how was he to know what conditions they would encounter in combat? The pilots, and particularly Lieutenant Stewart, the fighter leader, looked upon the whole manoeuvre with extreme distaste. A night carrier landing, said Lieutenant Stewart, was like a parachute jump. There was no use practicing, because if you didn't do it right the first time, you didn't have a problem. But the captain issued the orders, so they went. Coming down was something else again. Stewart took his FM2 up, and when he came in on the Carrier for landing, all he could see was a red suit luminous in the night, red gloves, paddles, and hat, but no landing signal officer. Lieutenant McClendon was there underneath all that finery, but Stewart walked away to the ready room, muttering that he felt like he had been brought in by the devil himself. That was also the night when one fighter pilot misjudged his approach, bounced, gunned his engine, flew directly across the deck full of parked planes, and came in for another shot. Lieutenant Elmo, wearing the assistant air officer, swore that was the night his grey hairs started sprouting. When it was over, however, even the captain brightened a bit. Steaming back to Pearl Harbor, he gave the crew a well done and told them they were now ready to go out and meet the Japanese. It would not be long. The scuttlebutt said they were going to be part of a striking force to go after the enemy. The Gambier Bay had a hot reception when she arrived back at Pearl Harbor on May 20th. That same afternoon, a fire started aboard one of a group of landing ship tanks loading ammunition at the Pearl City Ordnance Dock. The landing ship tank blazed, blew up, and spread the fire throughout the little fleet. Several more ships blew up. Firefighters and fire trucks scurried across the base, but the fire continued to rage, punctuated all afternoon and night by explosions of high-velocity ammunition. Tugs stood off and sprayed the stricken ships with no apparent effect, and before the night was over, 6 landing ship tanks had been destroyed, as well as a number of smaller vessels. The scuttlebutt had it that the new operation had to be delayed. That was not true, although a little more time was needed to put everything right on board. To Captain Goodwin, putting everything right meant having aboard the Gambier Bay men he felt confident in. One of these was Lieutenant Coleman, who, as predicted, had never pleased the captain at all. As a watch officer, the captain would not let Coleman stand watch unsupervised. He did not want an officer aboard who could not stand watch alone if necessary. Fortunately, as he was turning the matter over in his mind, Captain Goodwin discovered that Lieutenant Coleman had the same idea. The lieutenant came to his cabin and saluted. "Captain, may I speak very frankly with you?" The reply was, "Of course." "Captain, you know I'm sure that I am never going to be able to stand officer of the deck watch which will satisfy you. Well, I have about reached that same conclusion. I have a friend here in the assignment desk in the Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet Headquarters officers' pool. Would it be all right with you if I arranged to be detached and ordered to that pool for further assignment?" "Would it? It would ever," the captain said with all smiles. "I think you have hit on a perfect solution." So they shook hands on it, and the next day Lieutenant Coleman was gone. 2 or 3 days later, Lieutenant Broad, the communications officer, came back from base chuckling as he stepped onto the bridge. "Captain, I've got some news that's going to knock you over backward." "What's that?" "You know Coleman? You sent him to the pool?" "Yes, of course. He and I agreed that was the best thing to do. Well, Coleman now has orders as the commanding officer of a landing ship tank. Good God, said Captain Goodwin. What is the Navy coming to? Down below the bridge, in his cubbyhole of an office, Commander Huxell was putting things right in another fashion. 3 new fighter pilots had reported aboard just before they headed out for manoeuvres. Hux had heard about 2 of them, Ensign Leo Zola and Ensign John Tetz. Their records contained some interesting reading. After Zola had narrowly escaped washout during training, he had been assigned at Christmas time to the Naval Air Station at Sanford, Florida. There he became friends with another pilot in his flight, Johnny Tetz. They flew together day after day, learning operations in F-4F Wildcat fighters. They advanced to the air station at Glenview, Illinois, and qualified with their 6 land aboard SS Wolverine, the old ferry boat, a converted carrier. Then they were assigned to Trenton, New Jersey. At Trenton, the 2 hot pilots were introduced to the FM-2, which was the newest model Wildcat, originally called the F-4F when made by Grumman, or the FM-1 when made by General Motors. The new FM-2 weighed 700 pounds less than the planes Zola and Tetz were used to flying, but had an additional 200 horsepower in the engine, a hot aircraft, as Ensign Zola put it. But it had some troubles. The valve seats tended to come loose in flight, and when the Navy learned this, a new program was started. Every General Motors FM-2 delivered by the plant at Linden, New Jersey had to be taken to the Naval Aircraft Factory at Philadelphia to correct the deficiency. Then the planes were flown to the West Coast. Soon, pilots Zola and Tetz were being flown in a transport to Lyon each day, where they picked up FM-2S to fly to the factory. Sometimes when Zola and Tetz picked up a plane, they found it had less than an hour's flying time on its record. That meant they had to fly around for more than 2 hours to give the aircraft its proper test before landing. One day, a dozen Trenton pilots boarded the transport and were duly delivered to the field. On the way there, they began talking about New York. Say, Ensign Zola, wouldn't it be nice to see the Statue of Liberty and the Empire State Building? Yeah, piped up Ensign Tetz, and the talk became general and enthusiastic. The transport plane landed, and the pilots picked up their planes. Soon, in 2s and 3s, they were taking off. About half an hour later, the newspapers, radio stations, and New York City Hall began getting telephone calls. Hey, I just saw an airplane fly underneath the Brooklyn Bridge. There goes another and another. Hey, I'm looking out at Central Park. There's half a dozen airplanes out there buzzing the trees. What is it? Are the Japanese attacking? Hey, I'm up here on the 33rd floor of the Empire State Building. I'm not crazy or anything, but you know what? I just saw an airplane circling around the building. What did it have on the wings? The white star and the red and blue? What kind? I don't know what kind. The calls kept coming. Soon the switchboards of the newspapers and radio stations and City Hall were ringing, as well as those of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, where the appearance of airplanes was not regarded as a joke. The Eastern Sea Frontier, with its offices down by City Hall, found it was no joke either. Rear Admiral Adolphus Andrews in particular found it was no joke when he received a telephone call from Admiral King, who had apparently just been talking to Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia. Everyone concerned was extremely hot under the collar. Admiral King had assured the civilian authorities that New York was not under attack, but when the civilians wanted to know just what was happening, the Commander-in-Chief could not tell them. During the next few hours, all the Army air bases were checked out and all the Coast Guard stations. And Navy air stations were asked to account for their aircraft. Inexorably, the finger pointed toward Trenton, where only their planes were unaccounted for. Ensign Leo Zola and Ensign John Tetz had filed Trenton local flight plans before taking off that day. Did they go up over Trenton and stay up there? That was the question asked the next morning when all the pilots reported to the flight line after breakfast. They were sent to the operations office and lined up. An officer came forward and asked each pilot if they had been over New York City the day before. Every man vigorously denied any knowledge of New York City on that day. "All right," said the operations officer. "You will each write out a statement and sign it." All complied, but before the morning was over, several of the culprits realized they had perjured themselves in a legal written document and came forward to admit their part in the prank. The whole dozen were grounded immediately, and the confessors were shipped out, though where Zola and Tetz did not know. Those who did not confess were not shipped away just then, but in a matter of days a military detail showed up. The 4 remaining pilots, including Ensign Tetz and Ensign Zola, were hustled into a DC-3 with armed guards standing in the aisles. They were flown under arrest to the Naval Air Station at Brooklyn. Zola and Tetz, having had their local Trenton flight plans to back them up, were put back aboard the transport plane and returned to Trenton free of charges. However, the commanding officer at Trenton wanted no more part of these particular pilots, so they were assigned to a detail picking up aircraft and ferrying them to the West Coast as their ultimate objective. They flew to Philadelphia and picked up modified FM-2S. There, Ensigns Zola and Tetz got to talking with Ensigns Tetz. "Gee," Zola said, "wouldn't it be nice to see Washington, D.C.? I've never been there, and neither has Ensign Tetz." Their flight plan marked out a large restricted area over Washington, and the lieutenant leading the flight observed the orders perfectly. However, near Washington, Ensign Zola and Ensign Tetz, in the back of the formation, dropped out and flew directly over the White House, nice and low, so they could have a good look. They then poured on the speed and caught up. The next time the flight leader looked around, it was as though they had never been out of formation. The telephones at the newspapers, radio stations, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the White House, the Pentagon, the Navy Annex, and the Police Department began to ring. High officialdom got on other telephones, wanting to know where the hell those airplanes had come from, and what was going on when the President of the United States was not safe from air attack, even by his own troops. Soon after, Zola was assigned to duty and sent to Barbers Point Naval Air Station in Hawaii to the pilot pool there. Johnny Tetz soon joined him. They began making the transition to the F-6F Hellcat fighter, which was the standard airplane for fleet carriers by the spring of 1944. But for these hot pilots, the F-6F seemed a tame bird compared to the FM-2. After a few weeks, he and Tetz asked if they could stay in FM-2S. Their orders were changed. They no longer headed for fleet carriers, but would become pilots in the composite squadrons that manned the Gambier Bay-class escort carriers, where the FM-2S were going. Zola and Tetz were assigned to Composite Squadron 10. As Commander Huxell read all this information about the travels of his new pilots, he also had access to the newest information which dealt with the Empire State Building incident, the Brooklyn Bridge, and the White House flight. Nothing had actually been pinned on these officers, but the information was right there with their official jackets. Huxell looked at Zola and Tetz narrowly. "You are a pair of hot pilots," he said. On his first refresher flight out to the escort carrier conducting the operations, Zola turned downwind, made a cross leg in approved fashion, and then an approach. The landing signal officer gave the signal to cut, and he did just as he had in the Great Lakes. He dumped the stick and dove for the deck. The FM-2 struck with a clang and jumped back into the air. The hook was 3 feet above any arresting wire, and suddenly he found himself floating at eye level with the bridge above the barrier. At low speed, he poured on the gas and got out of there. Miraculously, he stayed in the air and came around for a second pass. Once again he got the cut, dove for the deck, and this time managed to catch a wire and come to a halt. The Airedales rolled him around and back, and off he went again. The third time he repeated the performance of diving for the deck, bounced off again, and came eyeball to eyeball with the captain, who was glowering at this incompetent flyer. Into his earphones came the message, "Get that crazy son of a back to the beach." Shortly after came a more restrained message from the Combat Information Center ordering him back to Barbers Point. For the next 3 days, he lived in a flight suit and flew practice missions, landing on the runway and learning to take a landing signal officer's cut for what it meant, not to dive for the deck, but to release the back pressure and let the aircraft float in and land. Finally, he got the message, went back out to a carrier, and had fewer problems. So when Commander Huxell asked Zola if he was not the hottest pilot in the Navy, Ensign Zola was a bit more modest than he would have been earlier. This probably saved his neck with Huxell, for there before the squadron commander was a full report on all the incidents and a request from higher authority for an equally detailed report of disciplinary reaction meted out to the miscreants. Huxell read bits from the papers and chewed Zola and Tetz out unmercifully. "We do not," he said, "need any hotshot pilots in this squadron." Finally, he exhausted the issue. It was either keep them or send them back to the beach, and both young pilots looked satisfactorily cowed. "Okay," said the squadron commander. "You've had your last chance. From now on it's shape up or ship out." Pilots Zola and Tetz went quietly out of the cabin and onto the flight deck to get some air. The men of the Gambier Bay waited. They knew now what they were waiting for, the day when the invasion force, of which they were a part, would move out to strike the Japanese. The men of the ship had liberty every other day according to watch, and the officers too drew duty only every other day. So for the ship's complement, luxury was the watchword. For the pilots and air crewmen of Composite Squadron 10, the last 2 weeks of May 1944 were occupied by tactical training. Shortly after the ship tied up, Commander Huxell was called to a meeting in the movie theatre at Pearl Harbor. When Huxell got there, he found the theatre filling up with officers from dozens of ships. A Marine colonel stepped forward, and the briefing began. "It was going to be a tough operation," said the colonel. "The Japanese had proved at Tarawa and in the Marshalls how valiantly they could fight, even when outnumbered and outgunned. The difference was going to lie in the quality of effort the Americans could bring to this battle. The Navy, Nimitz, Spruance, General Smith expected the best that every man could offer, and he was sure they were going to get it. Let them make no mistake, men were going to get hurt and men were going to die, but the United States forces were going to take the Marianas and move on from there until they entered Tokyo." The colonel's briefing was inspiring, and Commander Huxell came away from it exalted. Then came another briefing for the airmen by Captain John Cromin of Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet Headquarters Staff. That officer got down to cases. The aviators were supplied with maps of Japan and with detailed information about their mission, including battle maps to show where the American ground forces would land and their objectives. After the Cromin briefing, Commander Huxell began training Composite Squadron 10 for the task, and torpedo pilots. Commander Huxell took his torpedo planes to Kauai to practice supply drops, in case the Marines encountered difficulties at Saipan, like those that had plagued them at Tarawa. Ensign Peasy was sent to aerial photo school at Barber's Point, where every day he flew along the coast of Oahu Island, practicing high-speed photography. Other pilots from the squadron went to school to learn aerial mine laying on the island of Kahulawe and practiced firing rockets on the north side of Mokai. This invasion of the Marianas would mark the first use of a new variety of rocket, and each torpedo plane would carry 6 of them. They also learned the use of napalm, the firebomb introduced by Admiral Harry Hill during the Marshalls invasion. The officers of the squadron spent much of their spare time at the Barber's Point Naval Air Station Officers Club, where they gathered at the bar to drink Barber's coolers made of rum and pineapple. 2 or 3 Barber's coolers tended to encourage somnolence or hijinks, and quiet understatement Hemingway style was in fashion. The young men would raise their glasses high and chant, "Hell, it's war," before chugging their drinks, quite unmindful that thousands of miles away, young Japanese airmen were quaffing their sake in much the same fashion. Some of the American flyers would gather around the piano to sing "Deep in the Heart of Texas," "Waltzing Matilda," and "Bless 'em All." These were the only war songs most of the young heroes knew, and one day, when one flyboy broke into "Anchors Away," the room joined him in a line. "Anchors away, my boys, anchors away." Then the room lapsed into embarrassed silence, as nobody knew the next line. General laughter covered the gaff, and these innocents forgave one another, for none of them had been in the war business all that long. Off-duty officers and men played softball separately in an old cow pasture at Pearl City, went to the movies, or chased girls in Honolulu. As May drew to a close, the tension grew. Seaman Heinel and Seaman Elbert Covington were on liberty in Waikiki one day when a siren sounded for an air raid drill. They were sitting in a bar drinking beer when the noise began, and the shore patrols came in to order them to an air raid shelter in Kapiolani Park. The bar was full of sailors and Marines, most of them fully aware that in a few days an air raid siren would mean the real thing to them. They shouted at the shore patrols to go away and leave them alone. The shore patrol, outnumbered, called on the army for assistance. Soon trucks came lumbering up carrying armed soldiers, and again the recalcitrants were ordered to participate in the drill. Again they refused, so the military police and shore patrols began throwing tear gas grenades. One grenade struck a Marine in the head and knocked him cold, and some of the sailors began throwing the grenades back at the army men. A full-scale riot was only narrowly averted when the servicemen finally went out into the park, but they never did enter the shelter.